This is the last session, and it's my welcome to those of you who weren't here earlier, and it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Heidi House, who's a lecturer in history and a Mellon Research Fellow at the Heyman Institute of Columbia University. She recently received her PhD from Princeton, and her research examines hands-on practices of surgeons and artisans to explore life in early modern Europe with a particular interest in the intersections of culture, medicine, and technology. I'm going to now turn this over to her, to Heidi.
So thank you so much for that kind introduction. On behalf of the Center for Public Scholarship at the New School and the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center of the Humanities at Columbia University, as a moderator, I'd like to welcome you all to the final panel. I'd like to welcome you all to this final panel of our conference on cons and scams, their place in American culture. So beginning yesterday, the many interlocutors of this conference have explored cons and scams in their many different guises, asking us, what makes us vulnerable to them? And also paying attention to the current political scene, which makes such a conference such a needed theme, an area of discussion, debate, and historical research that's really apropos to this moment. So far, as we've seen, this theme's been focused on in American culture, finance, education, law, and in our most recent panel, in art. So in this final session, we turn to yet another broad area in which cons and scams affect lives at every level of society, science and medicine. This is a dimension of deceit that touches, on the one hand, how we understand and treat the natural world around us, and on the other hand, how we understand and treat our own bodies. The stakes of differentiating between evidence-based theory earnestly presented and a con intended to swindle couldn't be higher. The ramifications can be broad, from government policy and spending to incredibly intimate with what we decide to put on or in our own bodies. Now, if we think about it, there is a way in which deceit is practiced in science and medicine in fairly acceptable and routine ways. Just think of medical and scientific research in which many researchers argue that the use of deception to conduct clinical trials or experiments is necessary to arrive at honest findings. This can mean deceiving participants about, for instance, whether the nature of a study will affect their behavior, or particularly in double-blind studies of drug treatments to prevent bias from affecting the results. What distinguishes the potentially murky ethics of those forms of routine deception from what our panel is focused on today is a lack of intention at getting at truth through the use of deception, perhaps. The interests of the deceiver lying largely, if not anywhere else, but in self-gain, in self-interest. And I say the interest of the deceiver lying largely in self-gain rather than entirely because, of course, there's always the possibility of individuals, at least, for instance, we can think of in medicine, who genuinely believe in their miracle cures. And that makes it all the more complicated for those around them to dismiss it. So we can see already that medicine and science, when we're talking about cons and scams, is a many-layered issue that needs our attention. And perhaps, given how high the stakes are, it's not always as straightforward as we'd like to believe, and we should take some time to unpack that. Through the course of this session, my hope is that we'll be able to start doing some of this unpacking of these problems of defining the categories of cons and scams, and also talk about its relationship to what we consider legitimate professional practices. Doing this both in talking about contemporary issues, but also looking at this historically through time. And so luckily, we have two great speakers who are going to do that for us. Our speakers, David Kevlas and Nina Shapiro, will give us multi-dimensional looks of cons and scams, past and present, from pseudo-scientific figures positing theories about climatology in the late 19th century, to the wonder drugs advertised on Dr. Oz. So I'm going to introduce them now, so we know who our interlocutors are, and then I will go over our format really quickly before I hand the mic over. So Daniel Kevlas, Stanley Woodward Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University, received his PhD from Princeton University in 1964. He writes about science, technology, medicine, and society, past and present. His many books include The Baltimore Case, A Trial of Politics, Science, and Character, In the Name of Eugenics, Genetics and the Uses of Human Heredity, and The Physicists, The History of a Scientific Community in Modern America. He's published articles, essays, and reviews in scholarly and popular journals. Among them, some of them you may have heard of, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Times Literary Supplement. Recently retired from a professorship at Yale. He's currently in New York as a visitor at NYU Law School and Columbia Law School. And today he'll be speaking on scientists versus charlatans, oceanography and climatology in mid-19th century America. Our second speaker, Nina Shapiro, is director of pediatric ear, nose, and throat at the Madel Children's Hospital, UCLA, and professor of head and neck surgery at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Shapiro received her MD at Harvard Medical School in 1991. She's won recognition from both professional and popular sources, from a certificate of honor from the American Academy of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery Foundation in 2007, to being listed in Super Doctors 2008 in Los Angeles Magazine. She's been interviewed by national news outlets, including CBS, CNN, NPR, The Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times for her expertise in dispelling inaccurate medical claims. So she's a useful person to have at a conference like this. In fact, her new book out May 1st is titled Hype, A Doctor's Guide to Medical Myths, Exaggerated Claims, and Bad Advice, How to Tell What's Real and What's Not. And today she'll be speaking on quackery and hype, mesmerized by wizards. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over. Format. Can't forget. So our format. I'm going to be turning the mics over to our speakers who will give their presentations. We're going to have a brief discussion among the panelists about the various issues raised by their talk. And then we're going to have a moderated Q&A with the audience, during which I'll ask you if you could raise your hand. We're going to have two people who are going to be running around with mics, who will get a mic to you. And if you could introduce yourself before you ask your question, that'll be great. And I'll remind all of this as we keep going. All right. So if you could join me in welcoming our speakers.
So thank you, Arian, and thank you, Heidi, for the introductions, and Arian for organizing this conference. I heard about it extremely timely, resonates with a variety of things going on in our society, and so it struck me as a good opportunity to visit the subject from the particular vantage point of my own area of specialty and knowledge, which is the history of science, technology, and medicine, but in the context of public policy. So without further ado, in the world of mid-19th century American science, the terms of art for cons and scams were quackery and charlatanism. The threat of both preoccupied scientists and physicians who were absorbed in constructing a nation at the time where reliable expert authority counted. Alexander Dallas Bache, whom you see up here, Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, and the superintendent of the U.S. Coast Survey, which, by the way, was the largest federal scientific agency at the time, and commanding a budget of $500,000 a year in the late 1850s, and with a staff of 700 people. found the threat of quackery and charlatanism pervasive in the arena of public policy making. In 1851, in 1851, he reminded a group of leading scientists assembled in Albany, New York, about the traditional charlatans in Europe, where the word denoted pretenders to medical knowledge, barbers, and bleeders in the town square, purveying quack drugs and surgeries to hapless patients. Our charlatans, he said, may have doffed the costume of the charlatans of old, keeping only their shoes and buckles. They were, nevertheless, equally pretentious in claiming knowledge that they did not or do not possess. But now, he said, a new and real danger had arisen. It was from what he called a modified charlatanism, which makes merit in one subject an excuse for asking authority and claims to be an arbiter in others. Now, Bache's friend, Joseph Henry, a world-class physicist and secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, was of like mind. When Henry was deciding whether to accept the offer of the secretaryship, Bache sent him a flattering note. "Come you must," he said, "redeem Washington, save this great national institution from the hands of charlatans." Why was this new charlatanism so much on the minds of Bache and Henry and their allies in the cause of American science at the time? Partly because they lived in the capital and were engaged in the government of a newly transcontinental nation. Remember, the Mexican War ended and we acquired California, etc., in 1846-48. Because also in this increasingly scientific and technological era, in this new age of telegraphs, canals and railroads, steamboats and clipper ships, the government was unavoidably confronted with having to devise policies bearing on what Bache itemized as commerce and navigation, naval or military concerns, the customs, roads, the lighthouses, the public lands, post offices, and post roads. All these decisions required access to reliable technical knowledge, the knowledge possessed by legitimate authorities rather than by pretenders. Amid these circumstances, Bache and Henry et al. Felt it imperative to prevent scientific pretenders from exercising influence beyond their range of expertise or gaining unjustifiable access to the public purse. As time went on, as technical knowledge diffused into ever more areas of American life, the need to wage war against charlatanism spread across an increasing number of fronts. Indeed, it continues in our own day. But in the brief time available to me, I will illustrate the point with two episodes from the mid-19th century. One centers on Matthew Fontaine Maury's use of the Navy's resources in the 1850s and the early 1860s to promote oceanography, religion, and himself. The other concerns the geologist John Wesley Powell's battle at the end of the 1870s against wrong-headed theories of climate in the interest of advancing scientifically grounded public policy for the arid lands of the West. No one ranked higher in Bache and Henry's gallery of scientific charlatans than Maury, a career naval officer whom you see here in mid-career. The product of a small cotton farm in Tennessee, he was largely self-taught, self-educated. After a seagoing accident confined him to shore, he took over the Navy's depot of charts and instruments in Washington, helped persuade Congress to establish a Naval Observatory, and successfully maneuvered to have himself appointed its director. Maury assiduously cultivated public support, wielding a capable pen and orienting the work of the observatory to the service of practical public needs, as distinct from basic astronomy. Bache and Henry disrespected Maury deeply. It was not because he lacked formal scientific training, so did many other scientists of the day, including Henry himself, or because he was committed to utilitarian work, so were they. They disrespected him so much because he let his ambitions get in the way of sound science. even of the practical sort. What most aroused their contempt for Maury was his work in oceanography. This work had its roots in a large cache of moldy ship's logs that Maury discovered when he took charge of the depot of charts and instruments. Maury noticed that many brimmed with information about winds, weather, currents, and temperatures recorded by date at the vessel's location as it sailed across the seas. He ingeniously, and we must give him credit for this, recognized that the records added up to a bonanza of data bearing on meteorological and hydrographic patterns in different regions of the oceans as they varied through the months, through the weeks, through the months, and through the years. Maury deployed some of his staff to organize the data into charts summarizing the patterns. Ship captains could use the charts to set courses that took advantage of wind and currents while avoiding storms. Between 1847 and 1849, Maury published 8 sheets titled Wind and Current Charts, each about 2 feet by 3 feet, that together covered the North Atlantic. They appeared when clipper ships were enabling speedy ocean travel, and the gold rush was putting a premium on reducing the time required to get from New York to San Francisco. From the first, Maury's charts were acclaimed for helping to reduce time between distant ports by at least a third. Demand for the charts skyrocketed, and Maury's charts then were extended to the other oceans of the world. In 1850, Maury published Explanations and Sailing Directions, which was a how-to, here's a typical page from it, which was a how-to guide for using the charts that came to 18 pages in the first edition, then expanded to 772 pages in the 6th edition, which appeared in 1854. British shippers calculated that his charts saved them $10 million a year. He was the toast of the Atlantic community, admired, celebrated, and bemedaled by monarchs and learned societies alike. And here you see an homage to Maury, pardon this typo in the title, a world map that includes, it says, courant de l'atmosphère, and with something by Lieutenant Maury. Maury soon stitched material from his explanations into a book about the new science of oceanography. And here is the book, first edition. A pioneering work, first published in 1856, it was titled The Physical Geography of the Sea. It recounted with literary flair the features of the oceans, the variations across the globe of their wind and weather patterns, their temperatures and currents, including the mysterious Gulf Stream, and offered dynamic theories for their presence and behavior. The book was widely acclaimed and was translated into half a dozen European languages, but Bache, Henry, and their allies counted it a travesty of sober-minded science. It was riddled with errors, ignored other works in oceanography, and was suffused with unsupported and indeed unsupportable speculations, some of them religious. Maury was a devout Christian and took the Bible, which he knew well, literally. Like many scientists of the day, he saw the hand of God at work in nature. But unlike them, Maury found in biblical texts causes of the physical workings of the natural world. To his mind, for example, biblical passages had assisted man in understanding the patterns of oceanic winds. It was clear to him from Genesis, for example, that seawater had been salty from the moment of its creation. Since, according to the Bible, the seas covered the earth before God created land, seawater could not have been made salty by depositions from the earth, by the land, or by washings of brine by rain, dew, or mists. It had to be there first, the salt. Religiosity aside, some of his technical arguments struck one critic, a mathematical physicist at Harvard, as outside, to quote him, the logic of possible physics and a real celestial mechanics. In Joseph Henry's summary judgment, Maury's book, quote, contains more absurd propositions than are to be found in any book ever published by a person in such high position. Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, Maury quickly decamped to the Confederacy and was in bad odor in the Navy Department. In 1863, the Navy asked the new National Academy of Sciences whether Maury's charts and sailing directions, which were incomplete, warranted the ongoing expense of further publication. The Academy's inquiry revealed that the Navy had spent a cumulative total of $329,000 on publishing Maury's charts, or in 2016 dollars, more than roughly $5 million. They had spent this amount of money in preparing and publishing the charts since their inception in 1850, and the Academy Committee assessed both the theoretical, empirical, and practical value of the works at far less, in any terms, than their cost. The Academy's final report, here's an excerpt from it, concluded that Maury's volumes embrace, quote, much which is unsound in philosophy and little that is practically useful. The report recommended that the charts and sailing directions no longer be published in their present form. The Navy immediately halted their publication, but it continued gathering the data the way Maury had done, and in the 1880s it began republishing these charts, though in a much more scientifically reliable way of presentation and claim. Despite that judgment of the Academy, Maury is today celebrated, especially in his native South, as the father of oceanography. His physical geography of the sea would remain in print for 20 years. Given its blend of poetic, religious, and oceanographic information, it resembled some of the popular creationist books of our own day. Perhaps we have to conclude that some forms of charlatanism are difficult to kill off, especially when they resonate with religion and regionalism. And here what you see is, I think you can see in the bottom, that's inspired by his inspiration, Holy Writ, on the plaque. This is in Richmond, Virginia in the 1920s, and that is that piece of sculpture atop the column is also in Richmond, and it shows Maury atop the world studying its climate. So let me turn then to John Wesley Powell and issues of climate and policy for the arid West. The charlatanism that John Wesley Powell felt duty-bound to contest was summarily expressed in the claim that rain follows the plow. The phrase was promulgated in a book published in 1881 by one Charles Dana Wilbur, a land speculator. It distilled the theories of some prominent earth scientists that settlement and cultivation, especially the planting of trees, would transform arid regions, notably the Great Plains beyond the 100th meridian, into fertile, loamy expanses bathed in rain like the agriculturally fecund Mississippi Valley. I'm going to skip these in the interest of time. I'll come back to them if you're interested. During the 1870s, as settlements spread westward through the Great Plains, rainfall happened to increase, giving a seeming plausibility to the claims, already current, that rain did follow the plow. But John Wesley Powell, a geologist, was unconvinced. Fame had come to Powell as a result of his intrepid journeys into territories hitherto unknown to most white Americans, as head of several successive Western surveys. Despite having lost his right forearm at Shiloh during the Civil War, he had scaled Long's Peak, braved the canyons of the Colorado River, and returned with valuable knowledge of the region, including maps. I seem to have skipped over a slide of Powell. There he is. Okay, and you can see the empty sleeve on the right. He was a great admirer, by the way, of Native Americans and started the Bureau of Ethnology in the Smithsonian Institution. So here you see the canyon of the Colorado, and here you see one of the maps from Powell's expedition. Powell was a social reformist advocate of material development. He was convinced that scientific knowledge had to be deployed to accommodate democratic social progress, to the realities of the land and its region. Thanks to Joseph Henry at the Smithsonian, which you see here, Powell had rainfall data. Henry had made the Smithsonian a center for the gathering by telegraph of far-flung meteorological data, its collation and analysis, and its integration into daily weather reports. His effort formed the foundation of the United States Weather Service. And here you see a map based on Henry's rainfall data from 1858. From Henry's data, Powell was aware that the west beyond the 100th meridian, a region accounting for some 40% of the land in the continental United States, experienced too little rainfall to sustain the conventional 160-acre homesteading agriculture that had long marked public land policy. Powell knew, in short, that most of the good public land, the kind a poor man could turn into a farm, had already been sold. So, the 100th meridian runs down through the Dakotas, down through Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and into Texas. Beyond that is where the arid region, 40% of the then land of the United States. And here's a modern map with green showing fecund areas and yellow, orange, brown, brownish orange, the arid region, and here is the arid region of the United States. It's pretty big, as you can see. In 1878, in a report on the lands of the arid region of the United States, Powell wrote, "Many conjectures and hypotheses," this is apropos, rain follows the plow, "many conjectures and hypotheses had been advanced to account for the increased rainfall." Continuing, "Many have attributed the change to the laying of railroad tracks and construction of telegraph lines, others to the cultivation of the soil, and not a few to the interposition of divine providence in behalf of the Latter-day Saints." But he had to add that in what manner rainfall could be effected through the cultivation of the land, building of railroads, telegraph lines, etc., has not been shown. Powell contended that rainfall in the arid region would never be adequate to sustain agriculture based on the traditional 160-acre homestead. That system of apportionment had to give way to one that allowed for much larger sections, suitable in some cases for dry land ranching and in other cases for irrigated farming. Powell's ideas formed the basis of a legislative bill for the arid region that was introduced in Congress in February 1879 and that was commended by Easterners on both sides of the aisle as wise, realistic, and scientifically authoritative. But representatives from the western states and territories, ambitious inhabitants of a developing and settler-hungry region, ripped into the proposal and defeated it. Had scientists said that the land was too arid for small farms, Congressman Martin McGinnis from the Montana Tory cried that theorists had pronounced the homestead system dead before, yet settlers had gone west and, quote, practical men all had seen the capabilities of this land which had escaped the notice of our scientists and statesmen. A congressman from Kansas admonished scientists who explored the West, "If you please, while you are out there acting in the interest of science and in the interest of professional bug hunting, leave the settlers upon our frontier alone." Powell, nevertheless, had the science essentially right. On the plains during the 1880s and 1890s, rain ceased following the plow, ruining numerous settlers, and irrigation would prove indispensable to farming in the region. Here you see the consequences of dryness in the region. But at the height of the dispute, opposition to the kind of land reform advanced by Powell had on its side the linkage of it to the interests of small farmers by Charles Dana Wilbur, who characterized the proposed departure from the, quote, equable 160-acre homestead system as the work of, quote, a powerful ring in Washington bent on serving the aristocratic taste of the cattle barons. They are the climate hoaxers of the day. The episode would not be the last, as we know, to pit a theory of climate ultimately proved wrong against a contrary theory supported by data and ultimately proved right, all amid a passionate contest over political economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Today I'm going to be speaking about quackery, hype, charlatans, mesmerists, wizards, researchers, and all of us. I wish to thank Professor Mack for inviting me to participate, and I wish to thank Alex also for her help to this Cons and Scams conference. And I would also like to thank Dr. Lydia Kang, who is the author of Quackery, who suggested that this conference would be a perfect fit with my interest in scams and my book Hype, which is in many ways a current-day sequel to her detailed description of some of the worst cures in history. But unlike in prior centuries, where we relied on the traveling huckster going door to door, peddling their snake oil, now the touch of a button on our phone, a soundbite on the radio, or a catchy product placement may be all we need to get duped. And while the Cons and Scams conference title may bring to mind classic fictional con artists, such as Redford and Newman in The Sting, or real-life scammers such as Bernie Madoff, I venture to say that there is more wizardry and trickery in the health sphere than most anywhere else. Many medically related tricks, hoaxes, and scams are based on our ever-present hope and quest for better health, longer life, and quick fixes. When we hear crazy cures in history, it's easy to say that quacks were behind it, and that there must have been secondary gain known to the purveyor. But this is not always the case. Many in the audience may remember ads featuring doctors touting the benefits of cigarettes or the dangers of exercise during pregnancy. And while there are those who do indeed prey on the fears of their audience, the quacks of yesteryear were often the innovators of their day, and vice versa. In 2017, almost 150 years after the clowns donned their red noses, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus closed their doors. Many of us remember going to this greatest show on earth as a kid, as a parent, or as a grandparent. And in recent years, more and more of us have learned about the animal abuse and human abuse that went on behind this three-ring circus. P.T. Barnum was a supreme huckster of his day. His popularity grew and thrived on the human nature of craving the extreme, the strange or the impossible, the trick, the hoax, or the hype. Even in the years before the renowned circus came to be, Barnum would advertise and exhibit the beautiful Fiji mermaid, who was actually an altered ape skull sewn to a fish's body. In the mid-1800s, Barnum also claimed that George Washington's 161-year-old nurse would be on site to tell tales of our dearly departed first president. Weren't people gullible back in those days? A mermaid? A century-and-a-half-year-old nurse? Thousands fell for it. Good thing we don't fall for ridiculous stunts like that anymore. At the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, a YouTube video went viral where over 5 million people worldwide gawked at the amazement of a wild feral wolf entering the dormitory of the U.S. Olympic team athletes, the Sochi Wolf event. On closer look here, you can see that it's TV host Jimmy Kimmel, who planned the hoax using a rescue animal in a Hollywood studio. But 5 million people fell for it just 4 years ago. Goodness, we are gullible. So the question remains, if we continue to fall prey to trickery, who's to know what's real? Terms such as charlatan and quack are rarely used in current-day vernacular, but just to review their meaning, charlatan is of Italian origin, charlatano, meaning one who sells salves or other drugs in public, pulls teeth, and exhibits tricks of the legerdemain or sleight of hand. He, almost always a he historically, endeavors to pass the false for the genuine and turns the credulity of his fellow men to profit. In today's parlance, this would be the scam doctor preying on a patient's desperation for cure or offering treatments laced with today's buzzwords such as natural, non-invasive, alternative, organic, or homeopathic. A quack is in many ways similar to a charlatan, whose excessive zeal in a public place may sound similar to a quacking duck. A quack is ignorant of medical skill, but boasts wonderful remedies and cure-alls. Hype implies exaggeration. It may not be false, but its extreme promotion and publicity raises questions as to the actual value of a given treatment, product, or technology. There is usually a catch. Hyped medical breakthroughs use terms such as miraculous, life-altering, never before, and unbelievable. In medicine, and likely in most other fields of study, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. The term hedonic price function is actually an economic term, but it's based on the notion that a product claims to be healthier. Regardless of whether or not this is so, people are willing to pay more for it. This is often the case in medicine. Patients may seek out the most costly caregiver, as clearly they must be the best. Charlatanism and quackery are not new and date back thousands of years, but much of the erroneous use of such pure items as elements was based on a genuine belief, not malicious trickery, that these substances added health and vitality. As far back as 2500 BC, the Chinese recognized that gold was resistant to corrosion and associated with long life. Even before the alchemy of the medieval times, drinking gold was thought to bring longevity. Instead, it brings expensive stool at best and kidney failure at worst. Less expensive, but just as bizarre, is medicinal silver consumption. While it can be used topically today in antibacterials, ingestion was common in the wealthy set of years past from the silver of their spoons. Silver ingestion leads to blue skin pigmentation or argyria, thus the term blue blood. Mercury, the only metal that is a liquid at room temperature, is also known as quicksilver. This shiny metal was thought to carry magical powers, similar to those of the Roman god for which it's named. The emperor of the Qin dynasty drank mercury for longevity, but sadly died of mercury poisoning. Abraham Lincoln took mercury pills for his depression, but it only made him as mad as a hatter. In the mid-18th century, German physician Franz Mesmer claimed he could cure nervous system problems using a form of magnetism. According to him, health was maintained by the proper balance of a subtle fluid which floated through the universe. Mesmer presumed that this fluid was directed along the magnetic poles of the body, and the poles had to be in proper alignment to maintain a smooth, harmonious flow of this fluid. If the fluid balance was off, the patient would develop nervous afflictions, whereby the good doctor would mesmerize them to get the fluids aligned. During his time, there were those who followed him, those who feared him, and those who thought he was ridiculous. In today's world of health, he might be seen in a holistic healing spa offering crystals and even magnets to align one's spine and even one's soul. In today's terms, we'd call what Mesmer was treating to be psychosomatic illness. While these may be symptoms without real disease, we all know that our mental state can affect real disease. And while Mesmer profited from the people's gullibility, he may have indeed been providing an early form of the placebo with real effects. And his story is not too different from what we often see today. When we hear of a recommendation from one with authority, even if that authority is in the form of a public platform, even the skeptics can continue to be mesmerized. I'd like to share a story about John Harvey. Who knows who John Harvey was? Oh, don't say. Many of you may not have heard of him. He was a doctor in Battle Creek, Michigan in the late 19th century. There he ran a sanatorium where wealthy folks would go to get healthy by holistic methods. Today we'd call it a medical spa, longevity center, or detox juice cleanse outlet. His spa offered a lot of good: high-fiber diets, regular exercise, no smoking or drinking, and deep breathing exercises. Sounds like Canyon Ranch. But some of the other required practices included machine-run multi-gallon enemas, mandatory celibacy, and hydrotherapy massage, to name a few. Well-known guests included William Howard Taft, Amelia Earhart, and Henry Ford. But there was something else that John Harvey was famous for. He and his brother Will invented Kellogg's cornflakes. Thankfully, his breakfast cereals have had better longevity and much healthier benefits than his health spa. In centuries past, quality of health recommendations was based on trusting the source, which was usually in the form of a person, be them truthful or nefarious. In the days of today's peer-reviewed journal articles, government-run institutes, and harsh punishments for plagiarism and falsifying data, we should be beyond the shadiness of those such as Mesmer and Harvey. Sadly, this is not so. In 2005, researchers from Stanford and Harvard submitted a 10-page paper called Get Me Off Your Blanking Mailing List. I know I'm on YouTube. As a joke reply to unwanted conference invitations. This paper, which contains these 7 words, repeated 863 times, has been in circulation ever since. In 2014, another professor, also frustrated by unsolicited spam journal invitations, submitted this document to the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology in hopes that the solicitation would stop. Well, the paper was accepted and rated excellent. It turns out this and hundreds of other predatory journals are out there, requiring sums of up to thousands of dollars for authors to pay in order for publication. And while this one is clearly an extreme example of how pseudoscience and fraud can be, what's scarier is when seemingly legitimate articles, which are actually nonsense, are submitted, accepted, and published. In 2013, science writer John Bohannon created a fake name, a fake study, and submitted it to predatory scam journals. He submitted it to 304 open access scam journals, and the paper was accepted at over half of them. But despite this and other sting operations, as of 2016, almost 900 predatory journals continue to exist and publish nonsense. And this just arrived in my mailbox a few weeks ago, and I apologize for the font, but basically it says, "Dear error, merge field was not found, sorry to bother, but please help me with your valuable work. Your email within 24 hours will boost a hope in me. Awaiting your rapid comeback, sincerely, Emma." And speaking of nonsense, many of us have heard of Andrew Wakefield. In 1998, he published a small study in the journal Lancet, claiming that the MMR, or measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, was linked to pervasive developmental disorders commonly known today as autism. This study involved 12 children and was the basis of an international debate on vaccine safety, which continues today. Not only was this a very small study, it was later found to be fraudulent. So if the Lancet can be fooled, any of us can. Linus Pauling was not a fraud. He was one of the most reputable research scientists of his day. At just 30 years old, he published a landmark paper in the Journal of the American Chemical Society, which eventually led to his winning the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1954. He was also a renowned pacifist who opposed U.S.-Japanese internment camps in World War II. He opposed nuclear arms and derided work on the Manhattan Project. For this, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1962. He won the National Medal of Science and was one of Time magazine's Men of the Year for 1961. But then, things got strange. Cue the Beach Boys. In 1965, he attended a talk by a so-called doctor who had received an honorary PhD from the Los Angeles College of Chiropractics. This Dr. Stone suggested that the secret to longevity was vitamin C. And for whatever reason, the sun, the California living, Pauling believed this and started taking and recommending 3,000 milligrams per day. Just to put this in perspective, the daily recommendation is 60 milligrams per day, and even vitamin C supplements contain about 250 to 1,000. This led to Pauling's connection with vitamin C preventing colds. Soon he increased his daily dose to 18,000 milligrams per day. After beginning his megadosing claims, he wrote an international bestseller called Vitamin C and the Common Cold, later reprinted as Vitamin C, the Common Cold, and the Flu. Soon after this, over 50 million Americans, myself and my family included, took vitamin C supplements to ward off colds and even the flu. Sorry to say, countless studies looking at thousands of subjects in multiple centers across multiple continents have shown no benefits from vitamin C supplements. And despite these published, although not internationally best-selling findings, vitamin C supplements remain one of the most common ones sold and are also added to smoothies and sold as travel powder cold prevention packets. And though Linus Pauling was a 2-time Nobel Prize winner for chemistry and peace, he is most noted for his hype of vitamin C. Complementary medicine in areas such as cancer treatment and chronic pain has revolutionized the treatment tolerance and clinical outcomes in thousands of patients. It is not a field to mock or balk at, but the key is that it is complementary, not standalone. When complementary is removed from the equation, the result can be at best harmless and useless, but at worst deadly. Unfortunately, we are vulnerable prey for alternative treatments. We want to be the outlier or the anomaly. Another draw of alternative therapy is the alternative language that goes with it. If we have toxins, we want to detox. If we are feeling contaminated, we want to cleanse. Some alternative medicine treatment centers are in resort areas and market themselves as exclusive holiday spas, complete with red carpet treatments, which may include big screen TVs, coffee enemas, colon hydrotherapy, and of course, high-dose vitamin C. Thermal or hyperthermal therapy warms the body to above 113 degrees, which is actually less than the heat of a sauna, with the goals of burning out cancer cells. When used in combination with traditional surgery, radiation, or chemotherapy, it may help, but it is not useful as a therapy unto itself. Atavistic therapy is based on the premise of atavism, or the recurrence of a trait seen in our ancestors from millions of years ago. The false notion is that cancer cells function as single-celled organisms and can be killed by certain drugs. These drugs that he's giving are actually antibiotics, not anti-cancer drugs. For all cures, such as atavism, spa treatments, or colon hydrotherapy that carry no actual physical cure, the placebo effect can be powerful, but can only go so far in the absence of real medicine. And while the platform of a pseudo-treatment center can carry power, an actor purveying medical advice can be even more powerful, such as Gwyneth Paltrow's bizarre health products, including coffee enemas and jade eggs. But the TV doctor can be magnitudes more powerful. Sometimes this advice can be carried to extreme, leading to unrealistic expectations promised, exaggerated claims, and worse, fabricated results. And even the TV doctor will be forced with explaining and later acknowledging the snake oil they are selling. While absurd health practices have been around for thousands of years, little has changed regarding our ability to be duped. And while over 4,000 years ago, gold was a drink of choice for longevity, current-day coffee enemas and jade eggs in one's nether regions are hardly a step in the right direction. The challenge to distinguish scam from reality is becoming harder, not easier, especially when the scammer believes his or her own hokum. Almost never is something miraculous. Unless you think it is, then the placebo effect has done its job. Thank you.
So thank you so much to our speakers for giving us such interesting looks at two seemingly different periods from today, and I think what Nina referred to as yesteryear, and showing us that actually there are a lot of continuities, and they're maybe not that different after all. So in terms of our discussion up here on the panel, just for a few minutes, I wanted to ask a couple of questions, things that seem to be common themes in both papers, and to see what our speakers think. And the first is that it seems that in some of these cases, we're talking about individuals who are letting their ambitions get the best of them, that there's a delusion, there might be a delusion of one's own importance, but also a desire to be noticed, that comes with pushing forward findings that might not actually be true. I mean, would you say that that's that I'm reading some of what came out of these papers correctly? And could you comment a little bit on it in each of the cases that you've talked about?
I think what Professor Kevles had said just to start was that if someone was known for something, that felt that they had license to be known for something completely different, that they had a platform and they can use that platform for anything else because they had authority in one particular area. And I think that is so easy today. So continues.
You know, it's a great question, Heidi. I have two responses. One is a question. The second is a question for you. And that is these kinds, the kind of scams or cons of quackery, charlatanism that I was speaking about or describing, thank you, are believed by their proponents. And this is different from, say, the artistic con, who knows that he or she is painting a phony, making a fake painting or what have you, or the Bernie Madoff, or that they're aware that they are promulgating a falsehood of some kind or another. What's truly interesting in most of science and medicine, I think, is that the people who advance miracle cures or quackery and so on tend to believe what they say, and that makes it more difficult, you see, in dissecting them and discerning that we are potentially being made victims of things that aren't true. There is a symbiotic relationship between, on the one hand, the promoter of ideas that others will recognize as false, and wishful thinking on our part. The settlers in the West wanted to believe that everything beyond the 100th meridian was there for the taking in conventional 160-acre farming. The people who used Maury's charts found them useful, but there is a confusion between, on the one hand, what was the contribution of clipper ship type technology to speeding up ocean travel on the one side, and on the other side taking advantage of Maury's charts, which were pretty unreliable, by the way. This leads me then to the second question, which is, you have described a lot of rich targets there, okay? But they're kind of things that can be cherry-picked in the world of biomedicine. What about the researchers at UCLA or Columbia or Yale or Harvard in biomedicine who call press conferences and announce that the latest oncogene that they have discovered, or chemical therapeutic or whatever, is going to lead to some kind of miraculous cure, or even an effective cure for some things that haven't really been managed yet? How do we distinguish between what may be illegitimate and legitimate in the recognized world of science, which was the case with Maury and with the guy whom I skipped over, Ferdinand Hayden, who was the head of the Geological Survey of the Territories, and a highly respected scientist. We owe to him the advocacy of making Yellowstone a national park. He was well regarded as a geologist, but as a climatologist, he was a disaster, all right, because he embraced rain follows the plow, and used his expertise, his standing in one area, to advance an expert claim that was false in another.
Yeah. Well, that's a long and tricky question. I think, one would hope that in institutions such as mine and yours, that there is some peer review and reasonable data that's being presented. I think the big issue is how it's presented. So if you discover something in your lab, that okra prevents breast cancer in mice, and you're calling a press conference in the middle of Los Angeles that's going to be on CNN that night, that okra all of a sudden is going to be picked off the shelves at Whole Foods because it prevented one group of mice to develop breast cancer, I think that's where the problem becomes. And I think people in science are being pulled into that want to be sort of part of it and to exaggerate their work, even if it's legitimate and it's presented in an academic journal in the appropriate way. It may be presented at a press conference completely differently. That same thing goes if there's a patient that has a certain illness or a horrible tragedy and comes out of surgery and there's going to be a press conference, you're not seeing what went on in the OR. So it creates a very different picture than the reality. And I think also scientists are being pulled into that want to be in the media and want to be in the press and want their research to get out there, and sometimes just getting put in an academic journal isn't enough. And so
Yeah, well, another point to raise, which would, I think, establish a strong connection between the earlier papers we've heard in this conference, especially this afternoon, is that everything that these scientists are doing is embedded in a commercial marketplace, right, these days, and earlier as well. Certainly money is involved all the time. You've got to pay for the research somehow, you've got to pay for salaries and laboratories, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a lack of transparency in the art market world, there's also a lack of transparency about the commercial interests or sources of funding, often in the biomedical world or other areas of science. So that's something that I think we could think about a lot.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that it seems to me, both in the talks and then from what has just been discussed now, is that time is a really important element in this. And I don't mean time as in a historical study involving time, but I mean that there is, unlike, we've made the comparison to an artwork in which a forger knows that the forgery is being made and it's there. And it may take some time to figure out that it's a forgery. But in terms of the different examples that we looked at in this session, that there was sort of dirt kind of kicked up as people argued theories back and forth, and it took some time in retrospect looking back to see which theory held out in the end. I mean, would you say that is a fairly important part of what's going on and what may distinguish when we're talking about cons, scams, quackery, and charlatans within the areas of medicine and science than perhaps maybe other areas that have been explored in the conference?
Well, certainly in medicine, we often have to go backwards when there's a new finding. Vitamin C is another, one example. Or cigarette smoking or vaping, which was considered to be healthy not too long ago. That we oftentimes have a new item, whether it's found in a lab or found in a store, and then you have to backpedal to sort of evaluate, and that could take years to evaluate the actual benefit of that.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the way to sort of elevate it to a sort of sociology of science level is to say that we often tend to forget that science is a process, and it's a dialogue or a multilogue among claims and counterclaims, new evidence, et cetera. At its best, everybody in the game is honest, but there tends to be not willful dishonesty so much as wishful dishonesty on the part of the players. And it has to do with, part of the wishful dishonesty has to do with, where's my next research grant going to come from, and so on. And it's well known in the world of people who study scientific fraud that most of the fraud is in biomedicine rather than in the physical sciences, and it's because most medical schools operate on a contract economy where your salary depends on your getting grants rather than being paid by endowment. If you have a salary that's guaranteed by endowment, then you can afford to be wrong. But if you have one that depends on grants, then it's very hazardous to be wrong. I would also say, apropos environment, Pauling spent his professional life, all of it in California. Right? What happened was that he left Caltech in the early 1960s because the trustees were after him because of there were some McCarthyites on the board who were hostile to him because of his position on test ban treaties, the test ban treaty and nuclear fallout. So he moved to the Bay Area. That's where he came out with the vitamin C.
The lecture was in LA.
That's where he pushed it most.
So I have one more question before I want to make sure we open things up to the audience to ask their own questions. And this is thinking about, we've seen what some of the dangers of cons and scams in areas of science and medicine can be. And I think the example of the article in The Lancet about connecting MMR to vaccines and autism is one that is an ongoing problem and danger today. But are there any advantages to have people out there who are, they have ambition, they believe in what they're doing, they're putting forward something controversial, and it gets people talking about it? Is there any advantage to this, or is it all disadvantage?
In the case of vaccines and autism, it's 99.9% disadvantage.
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, let's put that on that's the disadvantage category. Yeah, and but are there any advantages to having controversy stirred up that are later disproven at all?
It depends on the category of science you're talking about. There would be no advantage in having it out there, a discussion about the legitimacy of the law of gravity. Right. The law of gravity is part of settled science. Set aside the relativistic effects and so on. Scientists universally understand that under certain conditions, which are literally universal, the law of gravity works. It's where you have unsettled science, right? Where it's science in the stage of becoming. Lots of cancer research is in a stage of becoming, because we understand a huge amount more about the nature of cancer nowadays than we did at the turn of the 20th century. When a very distinguished oncologist here in New York gave a lecture in which he said, what we know about cancer now is nothing. Now we can say we know a lot about cancer. Do we know everything? No, absolutely. And so where you have unsettled science, unsettled biomedicine, unsettled, let's just stop at that, unsettled biomedicine, then their alternatives make sense, but the ideas need to be debated among people who are knowledgeable and certified. Otherwise, science is just not a democratic enterprise in the sense that everybody's opinion counts equally. The opinion of Albert Einstein or Niels Bohr or I can name any number of others, it counts for a lot more than mine, okay, in deciding on the legitimacy of scientific theories. I think that climate science is largely settled in the sense that believe that the fundamentals of it are well accepted by the world scientific community, that there is anthropogenic contribution to climate change in the gases that we emit into the atmosphere. As to exactly how it all works, as to what the role of the ocean is, what the time scale is, and so on, that's the unsettled part. But we know the fundamental, is my view. So.
Yes, would you agree with that?
I think in medicine it's always unsettled, which is why we go into medicine. We have protocols, we have screening guidelines, we have testing guidelines, and what we have today in 2018 was different from 3 years ago or 10 years ago, and 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be completely different. So I think, and that's the nature of medicine, that's why we are doctors.
But do you think that's true, say, of infectious disease? Like, simple bacterial infection?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
We had penicillin when I grew up. Now we can get a free lunch from the pharmaceutical rep. We don't do that anymore. But my point is that, yes, infectious disease is very different from when it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and will be different years from now. Zika, we didn't know about Zika years ago. We didn't, Ebola, even though Ebola is not new, all of a sudden Ebola is on everybody's radar. Well, not anymore. And then there will be another devastating virus that will come into JFK or LAX in a few years, and the world will be in an uproar from this virus. So I think infectious disease is evolving. Cancer is evolving. Screening protocols are evolving. Ear infections are evolving. And again, that's why we stay in medicine, because what the guidelines were or what was recommended when I was a resident is different from what I do now.
But what I meant is that, of course, it's evolving because new viruses appear and new therapies, new therapies and so on. But they don't negate the understanding of polio, that it comes from a virus called the polio virus, and we know how to prevent it by and large, right?
We do.
That's what I mean by settled science. That what changes in biomedicine, the evolving nature of biomedicine doesn't get rid of what, sound understandings
Right,
that
right.
had been proved, that had demonstrated as reliable over many decades.
I think
That's all I meant.
the difference is, and you brought this up in your talk, and it's also something we see today, is you mentioned the word opinion and fact. I think people now have used the word belief more and more in medicine and in healthcare. Do you believe in X, Y, or Z? As if it's now a belief system, not an opinion or a fact or based on evidence.
I mean, lay people do that, or doctors too.
Mostly lay people. Some doctors do, though.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to go ahead and open up questions to the audience. And we have two people working microphones. Yes, so Alex, you want to just go ahead and...
Do you want to point to people?
Sure. Let's start with the man in the yellow shirt over here, actually. I think got the jump on everyone else. So if you could please introduce yourself.
Alan Marlis, CUNY professor. Through my own experience and just looking at the world of medicine, it's become statistics driven. I had a polyp, 90% chance it was all right, but it's only the right side. 10% chance not so good. It's inverted. I said, well, 10% chance. No, in medicine, 99% is what we work with. Got to have the operation. All right, they cook it out, and it wasn't the problem. My feeling is this. Everyone knows statistics lie, right? Well, anyway, statistics are more connected to social sciences. And my feeling is that medicine, which is supposed to be a different kind of a science, is statistically driven and is becoming more statistically driven when a decision is made on what to do. And I think that that's a real slippery slope. And it creates a laziness or a lack of, the instinct of a doctor who's been doing the job for 30 years. But wait, the statistic says this, maybe I have to bow out. That's troubling to me.
Over to you.
No, what did Stalin say? The death of a man is a tragedy. The death of a population is a statistic. It's true. We do a lot of our work based on prior statistics, and what we have now, as opposed to a decade or two ago, is we have access to extremely large population bases. The SEER database is a huge cancer database that we now have, that we weren't able to study rare cancers before because you'd have one or two at an institution every 5 or 10 years. Now you can compile all this data, and certainly there, you have to, you need this, you need that, because that's what the data show, and that's what the statistics show. But ideally, if you have a doctor who individualizes care and not necessarily does things based purely on the data, but based on the patient. For instance, if you are a person who is a high risk for anesthesia, a high risk for bleeding, a high risk for postoperative complications, and have a 1% chance of having a malignancy, but a 40% chance of dying on the table, your surgeon may not want to operate on you. But if there's a small chance that a unilateral polyp is a malignancy, most surgeons are willing to put you and them at risk, or you. But again, usually we would hope that good doctors are still individualizing care.
Also, I think in complicated physical systems, the same thing applies, not just social science. In climate, people deal with statistics, all right? They distinguish between the weather and the climate. All right, so the weather is local, it's unique, but climate is long-term, it's a trend, and it's an averaging of the weather over many long periods of time. So you can't get away from statistics in any area of science.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have another hands. So the gentleman in the brown shirt front here, and then perhaps we can have the other mic ready to go. The gentleman in the blue back there. All right. So, yes, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm David Hill, and about 40 years ago I read a book by a Princetonian, Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And my understanding from that is that the establishment called people with new ideas and different ideas cons and charlatans, or bad words, things like that. They didn't accept them. for coming up with new things. And you mentioned the law of gravity, but I think Einstein was saying, you know, there's this new law you need to have when, you know, things are going very fast or close to the speed of light, things like that. But at the time, it took a while for it to be accepted and a long time to be proved. And also in medicine, that the doctor who said, yeah, it was the doctors who weren't washing their hands and had their ties hanging over the women, that was killing them or causing higher mortality rates. He was treated as a charlatan, and I think it destroyed his career, and he died in poverty. So any comments on this?
Well, historically, one can say, again, science is a process, and the system of legitimation is imperfect. It's a human system. And one wants to be careful to ensure that the system allows for the entertainment and serious consideration of dissident views. So what more can one say? But it's true that Einstein did prevail. He won a Nobel Prize in 1921 or 22, which is only 17 years after he promulgated the theory of special relativity. And his work was widely accepted as time went on, and blah, blah, blah. So some things are easier to confirm experimentally than others. So you have to look at it as a process, make sure the institutions remain open, that you're tolerant of dissident ideas, but you also have to have some system whereby you vet the dissident ideas. Some are crazy, right? People come up with crazy ideas. Anybody who's a teacher knows that. So.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman. My question is to perhaps Professor Shapiro. I've worked several decades in a broadcast network where we have constant fights over what I would consider quackery solutions to health. And I wanted to get the insight of the panel in two questions. First of all, I sometimes think that the propensity of many people to accept these is due to the fact that we do not have a soup to nuts rational health system for Americans, and that the anxiety of that drives many Americans to be attracted to cheap fixes that may cost a couple of $1,000s as opposed to the terrible expense of private health care, but they're willing to take that risk because it offers a solution to some problem. So I've had, in my lifetime, for the past few decades, battles with people coming up with false cancer cures. And secondly, when we interrogate the people who buy these things, it's always that it makes them feel good. It makes them have power about themselves. And I was wondering what your take on that is, because I do feel, based on that experience with literally hundreds of people, that is part of the basic problem. Our completely abominable national health care system that makes it attractive for people to think of quackery as a solution.
The healthcare system. It's a little big one for me to handle, but I will talk about people's desire to seek out other cures, and I think it's not limited to people who don't have access to healthcare. One of the inspirations for my writing this book recently was I worked with this very experienced operating room nurse with very good insurance who developed treatable breast cancer. She took medical leave, came back to work 6 months later, and she looked amazing. She lost weight, her skin was glowing, she looked beautiful, she looked great. And I said, wow, it's so great to see you. I'm so glad you weathered this difficult time. You look amazing. And she said, yeah, I ate raw food, and I take these certain herbs that I take, and I do all these exercises, and I feel great. I said, and that was it. She had no treatment. And she died 3 months later, a horrible death. And this was someone who had access to a tertiary care medical center, completely covered by her insurance. So I think it's not just the people who don't have access to care. I think it's people who wish to seek other ways. Again, as you said, it's a sense of power to make the choices, and I think people do need to have control over their healthcare choices and what they decide to do. But I think, unfortunately, people are getting a lot of misinformation from a lot of these healing spas that offer really just no medical treatment except for placebo effect. And I think that's really harming people. And it's unfortunate that people are seeking that as a way to get out of basic health care.
Well, I think that I fully agree with what you say. I'll just add one point to it. Let's say you had a completely equitable healthcare delivery system. There would still be people who seek alternatives because they're desperate, because not everything can be cured. That's a fact of life, and people will respond to it by, where they can afford it, to seek desperate cures.
Okay, yes, can we have the lady in the middle here? And the gentleman in the green back here. Thanks.
Why do you think it's so, I'm Diane Dubrovner with Parents Magazine. Why do you think it's so difficult to disprove false information? You talked about vitamin C, and a lot of people I think are really smart and respect are still buying a lot of vitamin C, and that industry is thriving, and yet you say countless studies have shown that it's not true. I mean, the FDA is obviously not cracking down on those manufacturers, but there are lots of examples of things that people refuse to be skeptical about.
I think a lot of it is based on personal experience. For instance, I take vitamin C and I don't get colds, so it must be because I take vitamin C. Or I'm sure you've heard from many people, I only get the flu when I get the flu shot, so I'm never getting the only year I got the flu was the year I got the flu shot, so I'm not getting the flu shot. So a lot of it is very personal.
And statistical.
And no statistics, but that's fine. So I think a lot of it is that. A lot of that is people crave something interesting and exciting. I mentioned Ebola before, and the year that Ebola hit the United States, nobody was talking about HIV or AIDS anymore. That was old news, even though there were 100 times more new AIDS cases than Ebola in the world that year. So I think that people enjoy that a little bit. And again, I think the placebo effect is real. And if vitamin C makes you feel better, take vitamin C. It's not going to, it's expensive, but it's not going to hurt anything. So I think a lot of it is people do things by habit and because they think it's good for them, and assuming it's not harmful, it's fine.
Just examine the number of different vitamins available in your drugstore. It's not just C. It's the whole alphabet.
Arnica to zinc.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Hi, Will Derringer, MIT. I was the chair of the second panel yesterday. So my question in some ways returns to the first question that Heidi asked. So I was thinking as I was hearing both of these talks that on the basis of the definitions of con we were using yesterday, there are almost no cons in these two talks. Right?
Cons in what?
There are almost no cons in these two talks, right? According to the definitions we were using yesterday. The Wakefield paper is maybe the only example, but Maury would not be a con. Pauling would not be a con. Mesmer might be a con, but and the issue would be this question of willful dishonesty. So I just wanted to kind of bring this up again in the sort of broader perspective of the conference. Is the concept of the con or the scam the right category for describing the particular kinds of problematic scientific and medical practice that you describe? What's the difference between calling them cons and just calling them, say, bad science? Mm-hmm. Sort of what's at stake in that distinction, or wrong science? And if we want to have a definition of the word con that includes these examples, what does that do? How does that change our notion of this kind of organizing category for the conference?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that there are a lot of willful cons in your cases, but I agree with you entirely that Maury was not a knowing con. Mr. Wilbur may have been, because he had a financial interest in land speculation. But I chose to discuss the subjects I did. I could have mentioned, given a different paper, say on the Great Diamond Hoax in the West in the latter third of the 19th century, where some guy salted the land with diamonds and found experts to say that there were diamonds there, and he made a bunch of money, et cetera. And then there are other cases as well in the fruit industry and et cetera. But I think it's important to take these cases as a kind of con, in the sense that people are vulnerable with serious consequences to themselves and to society, to government budgets and so on, and to, so to speak, to the fate of the nation, if we don't pay attention to serious misrepresentations of reality by scientists in one field who then pretend to offer expert opinion in another. That's a kind of con in the sense that these people are not experts so they're conning the world in the sense of pretending that they are experts in the area and that they're advancing views about. And I think that's where we need to be on caution.
Okay, so let's do a final 2 questions and then wrap up. So can we do the lady in purple here and the lady in the middle over here?
Are there cons in big pharma and agriculture?
Say again?
Are
Is
there
that a question?
Yes.
No, is there cons?
Are there cons in big pharma? 'Cause it's like applied science or agriculture when they're selling defoliants, in effect.
Well, I think there's misrepresentation, but there's less of. Let me put it this way: I think you have to distinguish between big pharma and agriculture, because big pharma is regulated in what it can say by the FDA. You're allowed to advertise directly to the consumer in the pharmaceutical industry nowadays, which you could not do before about the 1980s. There was an act of Congress that allowed it. But the FDA regulates what you can say. You can't say this will cure, et cetera. And you also have to give side effects. Anybody who watches MSNBC or other such programs at night, as my wife and I religiously do, you know that the list of potential side effects is longer than the list of potential benefits. And we joke to each other that what they need to say is, if you die, be sure to get in touch with your doctor. Right? So in agriculture, there is no regulation of what you can say about toxic chemicals, fertilizers, et cetera, insect controllers, et cetera, et cetera. So there is regulation, however, as to what you can use, and it's under EPA, but of course that is now dissolving under the rainmaking of Secretary Pruitt, but that's a different issue, I think.
Okay, so let's move on to our last question, and just wanted to remind you to introduce yourself.
Linda Selman.
Thanks.
And there is something in insurances that I think is really terrific. It's called a second opinion. And so that if you get an opinion from one physician, you go to a second one, in a sense, to affirm the first one. If there is disparaging feelings between them, then you can go to a third to find out who that person feels is correct. I had it with my shoulder. One physician who headed one very important hospital here in New York said, "Oh, I will operate." As a matter of fact, his PA said, we're going to operate. And I never even spoke to the doctor. And she told me everything. And I said, well, when will I speak to the doctor? Of course, he had confirmed it. I went to another physician, also chief of another important hospital here in New York, who said, I definitely would not operate on your shoulder, but proceeded to tell me why, which was because the muscle could not handle the surgery. So then I went to a third person, and he confirmed the second person, so I didn't and went to therapy. So my question is, in really serious situations in which we have to make a decision about our lives, what is it that we need to do? Where do we need to go? What kind of questions we need to ask so that at least when we make a decision, we feel it's beneficial to ourselves and our family and ultimately to our life?
Well, I think you answered that question by talking about what that second surgeon did. And it's not just that they said, he or she said that you don't need surgery, but they said why. I would imagine if the first surgeon came in and spoke to you and said, I think you need surgery because of X, Y, or Z, but those reasons were not compelling, you probably would have raised an eyebrow and walked out. And gotten a second opinion. So I think a lot of it is, again, doctors, you can look up all the data and look up all the peer-reviewed stuff, but what really matters, if you have the luxury to do that, is to make sure you have a relationship with your doctor where you feel that you're getting your questions answered. And if you're not, then regardless of even if the second doctor said, yes, I agree, you need surgery, you probably would have had the surgery with the second doctor because they actually spoke with you. So, I think, again, you answered your own question. I think you need to be with someone, especially when it comes to a surgeon, where you feel that it's going to be a good fit and that you're getting your questions answered. Because oftentimes you can, certainly if you're critically ill, whether it's from an acute problem or a chronic problem, and you're terrified and you're thrown all this information and all these words, and you're just panicked, then you need to step back a little. Obviously, unless it's a life and death emergency room kind of situation, you need to step back and say, let me think about this before I sign on the dotted line.
I'd just like to add something to that response, though. You were very savvy and aggressive. The vast majority, I would say, of Americans are not, with regard to being savvy or aggressive in the face of a medical problem. And part of the inadequacy of the contemporary medical system in the United States is that we don't pay attention to the need to make people savvy, not necessarily aggressive, but to provide an easy mechanism whereby if they are savvy, they can get answers if they know enough to, or savvy enough to ask the questions. So that we depend a lot on the savviness, not only in the kind of situation you describe about surgery, but also what kind of drugs to use, whether we should use a generic or a brand name, where the prices are different and so on. You can save a lot of money, by making a different choice in a drug. But you need to be savvy, and most of us are not. And so one of the issues that needs to be addressed in any kind of healthcare reform in the United States and making it more equitable is how you make people more savvy about how the system works, what their options are, where to find expert information, and so on. And maybe we ought to start in the high schools. Maybe there ought to be a course, in health savviness. Just the way we do driver's education, let's do health education from that point of view and others.
So I think savvy and aggressive is a pretty good note to end on then. If everyone can join me in thanking our speakers.